Leonidas stood at the narrowest point of the pass, and he knew this was the place. On his left, cliffs of gray limestone rose straight up, impossible to climb. On his right, the Malian Gulf crashed against the rocks. The path between them was just wide enough for a single cart. They called it the Hot Gates. The wind that morning carried the scent of salt and pine and a cold, metallic feeling. You know that feeling when you're waiting for something big, and the air just feels different, like before a storm hits. This was that. He turned and looked at his men, 300 Spartans. Their bronze breastplates and crimson cloaks were a shock of color against the stone. Behind them, stretching back along the winding path, were 7,000 other Greeks, Thespians, Thebans, men from Corinth and Mycenae, 7,300 total. He could count them all from where he stood. That was the point. A Spartan doesn't show doubt, but here's what he was thinking right then. This isn't about winning. The math doesn't work. This is about time. Every hour they hold this strip of dirt is an hour Athens uses to build ships, an hour the rest of Greece uses to stop arguing and pick up a spear. His captains approached. He gave orders without looking at them. The Phocians will guard the mountain trail. It was the only weakness, a goat path that led over the cliffs. Everyone else here. The pass is the funnel. They can only come at us a few dozen at a time. The allies shifted, their shield rims clinking softly. The Spartans didn't move. They just stared at the empty eastern end of the pass, where the road from Persia emerged. That's when the scout came running. He was a local, his face pale under the dirt. He stumbled to a halt, gasping for air. He didn't need to say a number. His eyes said it all. Leonidas leaned in. How close? The scout pointed a shaking hand back down the road. "You can hear them," he whispered. "You can feel it in the ground." And then they all felt it. A low, rhythmic tremor through the soles of their sandals. Not an earthquake, something worse. The synchronized tread of an army so vast it made the earth itself shudder. The waiting was over. The tremor in the ground became a steady drumbeat. Then a low hum, like a distant swarm. By noon, the first of them appeared at the eastern mouth of the pass. It wasn't a line of soldiers, it was a tide. Imagine looking out your window and seeing a crowd so large it blocks the street. Now multiply that by 100. That's what flooded the plain beyond the Hot Gates. 100,000 men. The dust from their march rose in a tawny cloud that hazed the sun. Their banners were a forest of color, purple, saffron, emerald, stitched with strange beasts and symbols. They kept coming, for an hour, then 2. The ground never stopped shaking. At the very front, silent and perfect, stood the immortals, 10,000 of them. Their robes were a deep, bloody scarlet. Their armor was scaled gold and bronze. They carried spears with silver points, and their faces were calm, almost bored. These were the men who had never lost. They didn't fill the plain, they became it. A living, breathing carpet of empire that stretched back to the horizon. On the wall, a young Theban let out a choked sound. No one shamed him for it. The scale was a physical weight. Leonidas watched, his face carved from the same stone as the cliffs. He did the math again. 100,000 against his 7,300. The numbers weren't just bad, they were a joke. Then movement. A single chariot, plated in gold and pulled by white horses, detached from the sea of humanity and rolled forward. It stopped just out of bowshot. A man in silk robes climbed down, adjusted his headdress, and began walking alone toward the Greek wall. No guard, no weapon. His arrogance was his armor. He stopped before the Spartan king. He didn't bow. "King Xerxes, lord of all men, offers you a choice," the envoy announced, his Greek precise and cold. "Lay down your arms, kneel, and you will be granted lordship over all Greece as his faithful servant." Leonidas didn't blink. "Come and take them." The envoy smiled, as if he'd expected this foolishness. Our arrows are so numerous they will blot out the sun." Next to Leonidas, a Spartan named Dinix barked a laugh. He spat on the rocky ground. "Good," he grunted. "Then we will fight in the shade." The envoy's smile vanished. He looked from Dinex's scarred face to Leonidas's unreadable one, gave a stiff nod, and turned back toward the ocean of gold and scarlet. The offer was made, the refusal was given. The only language left now was the one spoken with iron and blood. Behind the wall, 7,000 men tightened their grip on their spears. They all knew what came next. The envoy's gold chariot had barely vanished back into the Persian host when the horns sounded. Not a single blast, but a rolling wave of them echoing off the cliffs. It was the Medes who stepped forward first, 10,000 of them. They were not the immortals, but they were professionals, their wicker shields forming a bristling line a quarter-mile wide. They did not run, they walked, a slow, terrifying advance that made the earth tremble in a new rhythm. When they were 300 paces out, they stopped. The front ranks knelt. 10,000 bows were raised at once, the sound a single, vast creak of wood and sinew. Leonidas's voice cut the air, just one word: shields. 7,000 aspices came up as one, the Spartan shields, each 3 feet across and faced with bronze locked together with a crash of wood and metal. The Thebans, Corinthians, and others pressed in behind them, creating a wall of layered oak and bronze at the narrowest point of the pass. The sky went dark. It wasn't a metaphor. The first volley of arrows was so thick it genuinely blotted out the late afternoon sun, falling with a sound like sudden, violent hail. They thudded into shields, shattered on helmets, found gaps with wet, sickening punches. A few men screamed, the line held. Then the Medes charged. The sound when they hit was not a clash, it was a demolition. Think of the roar of a crowded stadium, that sheer volume of noise, but every shout is a man fighting for his life. The front rank of Medes crashed onto the Spartan shields and simply stopped, their momentum dying against the unyielding wall. The Spartans didn't push back. They leaned in, their dory spears punching forward from between the shield gaps in short, brutal jabs. You have to understand the geometry. The pass at its widest here was only 50 feet. The Persian numbers meant nothing. Only the men in the first 2 ranks could fight. The rest pressed uselessly from behind, trampling their own wounded. The Spartans, by contrast, could rotate fresh men from the rear ranks seamlessly. A hoplite would fight until his arm burned, then grunt and step back, another taking his place without the wall ever breaking. For the Medes, it was a slaughterhouse. Their shorter spears and wicker shields were useless against the armored Greek phalanx. They climbed over their own dead to reach the line, slipping on blood and entrails, only to be met by another mechanical thrust of a spear. The air grew thick with the smell of iron, sweat, and opened bowels. The fighting lasted until the sun dipped below the western cliffs, staining the carnage red. Finally, a Persian trumpet wailed a retreat. The Medes disengaged, stumbling back over the field they had created. When they were gone, silence fell, broken only by the moans of the dying and the heavy breathing of the Greeks. Before the Spartan wall lay a mound of the dead and wounded 2,000 men deep. The ground, already rocky, was now a slick, dark paste. Not a single Persian had gotten past the wall. Leonidas looked at the pile, then at the blood dripping from his own spear. The first test was over, they had passed, but the math was still a joke and Xerxes had just begun to play. The sun vanished, and with it, the heat. What remained was the cold, clinging damp of a battlefield at night. The Greeks did not leave the wall, they slumped where they stood, their backs against their blood-slicked shields, the adrenaline drain leaving their hands shaking. The only light came from a few scattered fires, kindled from broken spear shafts and Persian wicker shields. In that flickering orange glow, the cleanup began. This was not ceremony, this was maintenance. Spartans worked with the methodical exhaustion of farmers after a harvest. They pulled Persian dead from the mound, dragging them by the ankles into a growing stack to clear the killing ground for morning. The corpses were stripped of arrows, usable ammunition, and anything else of value. Their own wounded, few as they were carried to the rear. The moaning from the Persian side of the pass was a constant low hum on the night wind. Leonidas walked the line. He moved slowly, his own armor still on. He stopped before each of his Spartans. Not for speeches, for inspection. He would take a man's shield, turn it toward the firelight, and run his thumb along the edge, feeling for splits in the wood, testing the bronze facing. He checked spear shafts for cracks. He said nothing. The clap of his hand on a man's shoulder was the only review. Good or not good. They all passed. The allies watched him, this king moving like a ghost through the firelight. He was the still point, the anchor. When he passed, men sat up straighter. Then came the sharpening. Spartans sat cross-legged by the fires, their hands black with dried blood and dirt. They pulled broken spear tips from the pile of salvaged gear, using small whetstones from their kits. They began grinding new points onto the shattered iron. The sound was the soundtrack of that night, a soft, rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape that echoed off the cliffs, 10,000 times over. They were literally reforaking the weapons of the dead to kill more of the living. No one spoke. The work was the prayer. Leonidas finally stopped at the very front, where the mound had been highest. He looked down at the ground. The dirt wasn't dirt anymore. It was a thick, dark paste. He knelt, and for a moment he was just a man in the dark, his fingers tracing the cold, sticky earth. He stood and looked east. Beyond the narrow pass, the plain of Malice was alive with light, Persian campfires. Not hundreds, not thousands, tens of thousands. They spread across the darkness like a mirror image of the starry sky above, a sprawling orange constellation of men and horses and machines. The sheer scale of it was a physical weight. You know those nights when you're so keyed up you can't even close your eyes waiting for what comes next? That was this night for 7,000 men. Leonidas did not return to a tent. He did not sleep. He took his position in the very center of the line, his shield at his feet. He sat on a rock still warm from the day's sun and stared at those distant fires. The Medes were just the probe, the fingertip test. Tomorrow Xerxes would use his fist. The king's face, lit from below by the coals of a dying fire, showed nothing. No fear, no doubt, just a cold, patient calculation. He was counting those fires. He was measuring the distance. He was waiting for the dawn, and for the real war to begin. Dawn came not with light, but with sound. A deep, rhythmic thunder felt in the chest before it was heard in the ears. Drums from the Persian camp. 10,000 men began beating the hides stretched over their shields. It wasn't a call to battle, it was a statement, a promise of annihilation. Xerxes had watched from his golden throne on the hillside. He had seen his Medes break today. He would not send subjects. He would send his soul. The immortals. 10,000 of them. Their spear points were a field of silver grass in the morning sun. Their robes were scarlet and gold, their faces hidden behind masks of polished silver. They were called immortals because their number never changed. For every man who fell, another was instantly promoted to take his place. They had never lost, not once. They advanced into the pass, not with a charge, but with a walk, a silent, terrifying procession of perfect order. They filled the narrow space from cliff to sea, a living, breathing wall of elite killers moving toward the ragged Greek line. You have to understand the psychological weight of that. For the allies from Thespiae and Thebes, this was like seeing legends walk off a vase to kill you. Leonidas didn't blink. He stood in the center, his own scarlet cloak now stiff with yesterday's grime. He called a single order, just 2 words: down the line. Rotate ranks. This was the Spartan system, the machine. As the immortals closed the last 50 paces, the front rank of Spartans, the men who had borne the brunt of the first day, stepped back, not in retreat, in perfect drilled unison. The second rank stepped forward, their fresh shields slamming into position with a single deafening crack. The tired men moved to the rear, gulping water, wiping sweat, their hands on their knees. They would have minutes, then they'd step forward again. Think about that. Working in a team where everyone knows their job so well you don't even need to speak. That's the Spartan phalanx. It's a factory line for death. The immortals hit. The sound was different this time. Not the chaotic crash of the Medes, but a precise, hammering impact of disciplined force meeting immovable discipline. For an hour, it was a brutal, pushing match. Spear points jabbed over shield rims. Men grunted and strained. The Spartans in the front didn't try to kill the man in front of them. They killed the man to his left, where his shield didn't cover him. It was systematic, efficient, and horrifying. Xerxes, from his throne, watched his perfect regiment stall. Then they began to crumple. The narrow pass that funneled the Persians in now worked against them. Only so many could fight at once. The Spartans, fighting in shifts, were never tired. The immortals, piling in from behind, were just shoving their own front ranks onto Spartan spears. By midday, the unthinkable happened. The immortal line wavered. A silver-masked officer fell, and the man behind him didn't step up fast enough. A gap opened. A Spartan spear found it, then another. The perfect order shattered. The advance became a press. The press became a panic. They broke, the immortals. The unbeaten, the eternal turned and forced their way back through their own ranks, trampling the men behind them in their desperation to get out of that stone throat. Silence returned to the pass, broken only by the gasping of the Greeks and the distant, furious cries from the Persian camp. On the ground lay 1,000 immortals, their scarlet robes now dark and wet, their silver masks staring blankly at the Greek sun. The Spartans stepped back once more. The ranks rotated. Fresh men took the front. They didn't cheer, they just drank, and watched the plain, and waited for the next thing. Xerxes had thrown his best punch, and for the second day the wall had held. But the king on the hill was now a man with a problem, and a man with a problem stops throwing punches. He starts looking for a way around. The sun was at its peak, hammering the dusty plain into a shimmering haze. In the Persian camp, the silence was worse than the drums. 24 hours, 2 attacks, 2 bloody repulses. The math wasn't working. Xerxes sat in the stuffy shade of his command tent, staring at a map of the coastline that told him nothing he didn't already know. A wall of rock, a wall of men, a dead end. That's when the guards brought him the farmer. He was a local, a Greek from Trachis named Ephialtes. He stood trembling before the King of Kings, his clothes smelling of soil and goat. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a noble. He was a man who knew the mountains the way you know the lines on your own hands, and he was terrified. He pointed a dirty finger at the map, not at the pass, but at the dark, tangled lines representing the Kalidromos Mountains looming above it. His voice was a whisper, cracked with fear and opportunity. There was a path, a goat track, really. It started behind the Persian lines, wound up through the oak forests and scree slopes, and came out behind the hot gates. It emerged at a place called Anopeia. It was steep, it was treacherous, but it was unguarded. Think about that moment. The pivot point of history, and it smells like a shepherd. Ephialtes wasn't selling strategy, he was selling a secret. His price was probably gold, maybe a promise of safety, but what he was really trading was the fate of Greece. It's that moment when someone whispers the one thing that changes everything, and the air in the room goes still. Xerxes leaned forward. For 2 days, his face had been a mask of imperial fury. Now, for the first time, it changed. The frustration melted away, replaced by a cold, calculating light. He didn't smile with joy. He smiled with the relief of a man who has finally found the loose thread in an impossible knot. He asked questions, sharp and quick. How wide, how long, could men in armor make the climb? Ephialtes nodded, his hands still shaking. By nightfall, a determined force could be behind the Greeks by dawn. The order was given before the farmer had left the tent. No more frontal assaults, not yet. Xerxes called for Hydarnes, commander of the immortals. The plan was simple, brutal, and final. Take 20,000 of your best, the ones who can move quietly in the dark. Take this man as your guide. You move at dusk. You climb all night. You come down at their backs at first light. Outside, the afternoon sun blazed on the sea. In the pass, the Greeks rested, tending wounds, watching the stationary Persian host. They saw no new formations gathering, no fresh waves preparing to charge. They saw only the strange, quiet stillness of an army that had suddenly stopped trying to break the door down. They didn't know the door had just been unlocked. The lock was a mountain path. The key was a traitor's whisper, and the turning had already begun. Dusk on the second day, the kind of quiet that makes your skin prickle. In the pass, the Greeks ate stale bread and dried fish, the taste of blood still in the air. They watched the Persian campfires spark to life across the plain, 10,000 points of light in the gathering dark. A normal night, the last normal night. High up on the scree slopes of Mount Kalidromos, 2 Spartan scouts were not eating. They were motionless, pressed against cold rock, their eyes straining into the violet gloom below. They'd been watching the mountain since noon, and they saw it. Not an army, not at first. A snake of light, torches, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, winding up a distant goat track like a glowing thread being pulled through the mountainside. The lead scout, a man named Aristodemus, didn't need to count. The line was endless. It was moving west. It was moving behind them. He turned to his companion. No words, just a look. Then they were moving, scrambling down the treacherous slope in the near dark, their breath ragged, their sandals skidding on loose stone. Getting bad news and having to make a brutal choice in seconds. We've all faced versions of that. Their choice was simple: run faster. Leonidas was sitting on a flat rock near the Phocian wall, chewing a piece of hard bread, when they found him. He was looking at the sea, not the mountains. Aristodemus stumbled forward, his face pale with dust and dread, and delivered the message in 3 gasped sentences: the path, the torches, the flank. Leonidas stopped chewing. He didn't look up at the scout. He didn't curse. He didn't even stand. He simply stared at the dark water, his face lit by the low fire at his feet. He swallowed the bread. Think about that silence. The fate of everything resting on one man, and he takes 5 full seconds just to finish his meal. Then he moved. He stood, brushed the crumbs from his hands, and called for his officers. His voice was calm, flat, final. He gave 3 orders, and each one was a death sentence. First, every allied contingent from the Peloponnese, the Arcadians, the Corinthians, the Mantineans would withdraw now. Under cover of darkness. They would live to fight at the isthmus. Second, the local Phocian troops, the ones who were supposed to guard that mountain path, were gone. He didn't ask why. It didn't matter anymore. Third, he looked at the 700 men from Thespiae. They were not Spartans. They could leave with the others. Their commander stepped forward. He refused. They all refused. They would stay. So when the moon rose, the pass held only 300 Spartans and 700 Thespians, 1,400 men total, watching the torches of 20,000 immortals climb higher into the blackness above them. Leonidas finally looked up at the mountain. The calculation was done. The door was shut. They were no longer an army holding a pass. They were a wall, and a wall only has one purpose. The wall they built that final night wasn't stone. It was a grim mosaic of broken Persian shields, splintered spear shafts, and the bodies of the immortals who had fallen in the narrowest part of the pass. They stacked them 3 deep, a crude but solid barrier in the moonlight. No one slept. You don't sleep on the last night, by the low firelight. A Spartan named Dinekes worked a whetstone along the edge of his Zekphos. The rhythmic scrape was the only sound in his corner of the line. He looked at the man next to him, a young soldier staring silently into the flames. "You know," Dinekes said, his voice a dry rasp, "they say the sun never reaches the fields of Hades." He tested the blade's edge with his thumb. "All that shade after 2 days in this oven, it sounds like a holiday." A few men chuckled, a dark, tired sound. It wasn't bravado, it was the quiet acknowledgement of people who have accepted the final bill, that heavy, quiet understanding you get sitting with friends before something ends, knowing it might be the last time. They all had it now. Leonidas walked the line. He didn't give a speech. He didn't need to. He stopped before each man, his eyes holding theirs in the flickering light. He looked at the set of a jaw, the grip on a spear, the way a shield was leaned against a knee. He was memorizing them, not as a king, but as a commander who would lead them out at dawn and would, by duty, be the last to fall. He saw the fear, the resolve, the exhaustion. He acknowledged it all with a slight nod. That was the speech. When he finished, he returned to his spot by the Phocian wall. He looked east, where the first gray hint of morning would soon bleed into the stars. Behind him, the 300 and the 700 waited. They had run out of tomorrows. All that was left was the dawn and the duty it would bring. The gray light came, not as a sunrise, but as a slow lifting of shadow. The stars didn't fade so much as surrender. In that cold, silent hour, the sound began. It wasn't from the east. It came from the west, from behind them in the mountains, the deep, mournful blast of a Persian war horn. Then another answered it from the east, from Xerxes' main camp. Then another from the west, a conversation of doom closing the trap. Every Greek on the line heard it. That sound changes everything. It's the moment the walls of the world close in. There would be no more holding the pass. The geometry of their defense was now a death sentence. Leonidas didn't hesitate. He stood, the bronze of his muscled cuirass dull in the pre-dawn gloom. He didn't shout. His voice was calm, carrying in the still air. "Up! Form on me!" They left the wall of bodies and broken shields behind. It was useless now. Instead of retreating deeper into the narrows, Leonidas led them forward, out into a slightly wider part of the pass. The ground here was rocky, open, a place to die in, not a place to defend. "Shields," he said. The surviving Spartans and Thespians, perhaps 1,000 men in total, formed a circle. Not a phalanx facing one direction, but a hollow ring, shields locked edge to edge, spears bristling outward like a bronze hedgehog. In the center, the few remaining archers from Thespiae knocked their last arrows, hands steady. You have to understand the decision. They could have died backed against the cliff, picked apart. Leonidas chose to die in the open, to kill from a circle until there was no circle left. That split second when you decide to stop defending and start attacking, even though you know how it ends, that was the choice. They stood there, breathing fog into the cold air as the light grew. They could see movement now on the slopes above them, the glitter of Persian spear points descending the mountain trail. Before them, from the east, the first ranks of the immortals advanced, their colorful robes a stark contrast to the gray rock. No one spoke. The only sound was the rustle of linen, the creak of leather straps, the metallic tap of a spear shaft against a shield rim. Then the sun cleared the mountains. It flooded the pass with sudden, brutal light, glinting off 1,000 Persian bow tips as they drew back. For a heartbeat, the world was silent and gold. Then the sky went dark. The arrows fell like iron rain. They clattered against upturned shields, thudded into the ground, found gaps in the circle. Men went down silently, or not silently enough. The Persian infantry charged then, a roar of 10,000 voices, hitting the Greek circle from all sides at once. The circle held for an hour. It held. Spears punched forward, withdrew red. The Spartans fought in their methodical, brutal rhythm. Stab, step back, let the man behind step forward, stab again. But the circle was shrinking. For every Persian that fell, a Greek spear was lost, a shield was split, a man was dragged out of the line. Then Leonidas took a spear in the chest. It wasn't a heroic duel. It was a random thrust from the press of bodies, a Persian infantryman's lucky strike that slipped between the king's breastplate and his shield. Leonidas staggered. The breath left him in a wet gasp. He fell to one knee. What happened next wasn't in the Spartan training manual. It was pure, desperate instinct. As Persians surged forward to claim the king's body, to drag it back to Xerxes as a trophy, the Spartans closest to him did the only thing they could think of. They stopped fighting the enemy in front of them, turned their backs, and formed a tighter, smaller ring around their fallen king. They fought over his body, literally. When a Persian grabbed Leonidas's arm, a Spartan cut the hand off. When they tried to drag the body back, the Spartans dragged it back harder, forming a macabre, bloody tug of war in the middle of the slaughter. Their spears shattered on armor and bone, so they drew their short xiphos, swords, and fought in close, a storm of hacking, downward blows. Those swords not meant for this, notched and bent and broke. So they used their hands, and when their hands were broken or pinned, they used their teeth. Think about that image for a second. The last 100 Spartans, backs to each other in a knot around their dead king. No spears left, broken swords in their fists, biting and clawing at the gilded armor of the immortals. They weren't fighting for the pass anymore. They weren't fighting for victory, they were fighting for the meaning of the thing. For the idea that you do not let your king become a spectacle. You do not let your brother be desecrated, even here, especially here. One by one they were pulled down. The circle dissolved into isolated knots of resistance, then into single men, backs to the rocks, swinging splintered shield boards. The last one died standing. He was propped against a boulder, a deep gash across his throat, his shield still strapped to his lifeless arm. The Persians, wary even of the dead, gave him a wide berth. In the sudden quiet, the only sound was the wind through the pass and the distant cry of gulls from the Malian Gulf. That's the callback. That's the echo through time. Fighting for something when you know you've lost, not for the win, but for what it means. They bought every second of that final hour with their blood and their bones, and in doing so they bought Greece the one thing it desperately needed, a story that could unite it, a legend that could outrun the news of a defeat. The Persian army would march on, but they carried with them the tale of the men who could not be moved. And that tale was more dangerous to Xerxes than any living Spartan army. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the ringing, hollow quiet after a storm, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the rustle of scavenger birds settling on the rocks. Xerxes waited an hour before he entered the pass. He walked through a corridor of his own dead. 20,000 Persian and allied soldiers lay in heaps, their gilded armor dull with dust and blood. The air was thick with flies. He found Leonidas near the boulder where the last Spartan fell. The king's body was at the center of a small mountain of corpses, Greek and Persian tangled in a final embrace. Xerxes stood over him for a long time. He'd expected to feel triumph. He felt nothing but a cold, weary disgust. This piece of rock had cost him more than a dozen provinces. He gave a quiet order. A soldier stepped forward with an axe. The blow was clean. They mounted the head on a long pike, planting it in the earth where the Spartan wall had stood. The other Greek dead, the Thespians, Thebans, Helots, were stripped and buried in a mass grave where they fell, but Xerxes left the 300 Spartans exactly as they were. He left them in their broken armor, in their final defiant knots. He looked at them, and then he looked at his own army, camped silently on the plain. They were watching. They had seen the cost. Winning something that costs so much it doesn't feel like winning anymore. We've all had those hollow victories. The pass was his. The road to Athens was open. But as he stared at those 300 corpses, Xerxes understood a terrible truth. He had broken his army on their bodies. Not physically, something worse. He had shattered their belief in invincibility. They had watched the immortals break, watched 10,000 fall to so few. You can replace soldiers, you cannot unsee what they had seen. He won the hot gates. But the legend born in that blood-soaked pass would march ahead of him, reaching every Greek city long before his banners ever could. The runner reached Athens 28 days later. He didn't enter the city shouting. He stumbled through the gates at dawn, his sandals shredded, his face a mask of dust and exhaustion. He collapsed in the agora, and the words he choked out were the ones every Athenian feared: the pass is lost, Leonidas is dead, the Persian is coming. You know that kind of silence? It's not quiet. It's the sound of a world narrowing to a single terrible fact. The hot gates had held for 3 days. Now the road south was open, and nothing stood between Xerxes and the heart of Greece. They had 1 month. That was the gift. The 300 had bought them 30 days. The evacuation began that morning. It wasn't panic. It was a grim, mechanical exodus. Families loaded carts with what they could carry. Children, old people, sacks of grain, heirlooms. They streamed down to the port of Piraeus, a river of desperate humanity flowing onto every boat, raft, and fishing vessel that could float. The Athenian triremes, 200 sleek warships, formed a protective screen, their oars dipping in silent unison as they watched the horizon for the first sign of Persian sails. Behind them, the city emptied. The Acropolis stood silent, abandoned to the statues of the gods. Xerxes took his time. He let the story of Thermopylae march ahead of him, a tale of Spartan ferocity that chilled the blood of every Greek who heard it. But he also let them see his power. His army moved like a slow, deliberate fire across the land. When his scouts reported Athens was empty, he sent a detachment anyway. They burned it. The temples, the houses, the markets, all of it. Black smoke stained the sky for days, a signal fire of annihilation visible from the island of Salamis, where the entire Athenian population now huddled, watching their history turn to ash. The Persian fleet arrived a week later. 1,000 ships, triremes from Phoenicia and Egypt, supply vessels, horse transports, filled the Saronic Gulf. Their masts looked like a leafless forest. From the deck of his royal barge, Xerxes surveyed the Greek navy bottled up in the narrow straits between Salamis and the mainland. He saw a trapped, defeated enemy. He saw a final victory. He was wrong. Because those 30 days had done more than allow an evacuation. They had allowed something impossible: unity. The Spartan sacrifice had shamed the squabbling Greek city-states into one purpose. The Athenian fleet was no longer alone. Corinthian ships were there, Aeginetan triremes, even a contingent from Sparta, arriving too late for the land battle but ready for the sea. The Greek commander, an Athenian named Themistocles, had chosen the killing ground, the tight, winding channels around Salamis, where Persian numbers would mean nothing. Getting a second chance because someone else bought you time and knowing you can't waste it forges a different kind of resolve. It's colder, sharper. As the sun rose on the morning of the battle, the Greek rowers took their benches. They didn't look at the endless Persian fleet. They looked at the smoke still smudging the sky over Athens. They listened, and from the shore where Xerxes had set his golden throne to watch the victory, they heard the first faint beat of a war drum, then another. Then 100 more. The sound echoed off the cliffs of Salamis, a heartbeat answering the silence of the hot gates. The time bought with blood was up. Now it was time to pay it back. The stone lion is gone. The one Xerxes had erected to mark where Leonidas fell was toppled centuries ago. All that remains is a low mound of earth and a modern highway sign that says Thermopylae in Greek and English. Tour buses slow, cameras click from windows, and then the traffic flows on, heading north to Limia or south to Athens. Most never stop. If they do, they stand on a small overlook, squinting at the flat, reclaimed coastal plain, trying to square this quiet, sun-baked stretch with the legend. It doesn't look like a place where the world changed. The sea has retreated nearly 5 miles since 480 BC, leaving a wide, fertile valley where the Persian host once camped. The famous Hot Gates are now a narrow cut between scrub-covered hills, barely wide enough for 2 lanes of asphalt. The wind, though, that's the same. It still funnels through the pass, carrying the scent of salt from the distant Malian Gulf and dry pine from the Kalidromos Mountains. It's a clean, sharp wind. It carries no echo of screams, no taste of blood or dust. It has scoured all that away. But stand there, just for a minute. Ignore the trucks. Look at the contours of the hills where the Phocian wall once stood. Feel that wind on your face, the same wind that cooled the sweat on a Spartan's brow as he locked his shield. This is the weight of a place. It's not in the monuments, it's in the geography itself, in the stubborn rock and the relentless air. 300 men stood here and decided that a narrow pass was worth more than their lives. Their calculation made in a moment of brutal clarity, bought a month. That month saved a culture. Every history of the West has a before and an after. The line between them is often drawn in blood on forgotten ground. Here, the line was a shield wall 3 men deep. The wind blows through the Hot Gates now as then. It carries nothing but salt and pine. It asks for no remembrance. It simply is a witness that outlasts empires, a whisper that the most powerful forces are not always the largest, but those that choose to stand in the gap. But what about the man who showed them the path? The shepherd Ephialtes, who walked out of the mountains and into the Persian camp with betrayal in his mouth and a price on his head from the Spartans. He collected his reward from Xerxes, a bag of Persian gold, and then he vanished into the chaos of the war's aftermath. He thought he could disappear. He was wrong. When the Persian invasion finally shattered at the sea battle of Salamis and again at Plataea on land, the great host retreated back to Asia. The gold Ephialtes carried suddenly became a curse. He was a marked man in a Greece that now burned with a hard, unified fury. Every city-state knew his name, every magistrate had his description. He wasn't just a traitor, he was the reason 300 Spartans and 700 Thespians were dead. He was the crack in the shield wall. He fled from his home in Trachis, becoming a ghost moving through the back alleys of distant, seedy ports. For years, he lived in the shadows of places where no one asked questions, but a reputation once earned is a shadow you cannot outrun. How many nights did he start awake at a strange sound, the Greek word for nightmare, Ephialtes, now literally the name his mother gave him, haunting his sleep. The irony would have been cruel. He had traded a kingdom's fate for a bag of coins, and all it bought him was a lifetime of looking over his shoulder. The end came not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a grimy market square in Thessaly. Years later, he was older, worn thin by paranoia. He was haggling over the price of a loaf of bread when a man across the street stopped dead. The man was a blacksmith, a Thespian. His younger brother had stood with Leonidas on the 3rd day and had never come home. The blacksmith had carried that face, Ephialtes's face, described in tavern tales and on wanted scrolls in his mind for a decade. And there it was, aged but unmistakable, arguing over coppers. There was no speech, no dramatic challenge. The blacksmith crossed the market, his hands already curled from a lifetime at the forge. He didn't draw a weapon, he just used those hands. The fight was short, brutal, and utterly one-sided. When it was over, Ephialtes lay dead in the dust, the spilled bread beside him, the Persian gold long gone. The blacksmith stood over him, breathing hard, then turned and walked away without a word. No one moved to stop him. No one moved to help the fallen man. And here is the final judgment. No one buried him. In a culture that saw proper burial as sacred, essential for the soul's rest, Ephialtes was left where he fell. Dogs nosed at the edges of the market square that night. By morning, the body was gone, dragged away or covered with quicklime in some pit for the nameless. He had erased himself from history twice over, first by his act, then by his death. His name, Ephialtes, did not disappear. It transcended the man. It became the word Ephialtes, the nightmare that sits on your chest as you sleep, the sudden suffocating dread. The Greeks, with their brutal poetry, ensured that every time someone woke gasping from a bad dream, they would whisper the name of the traitor of Thermopylae. His legacy wasn't gold or infamy, it was a linguistic prison. He became the embodiment of the betrayal that visits you in the dark. This is the cost of a single selfish choice, not a dramatic death in battle, but a sordid end in a marketplace, forgotten by all except the language itself. History remembers traitors not by their victories, but by the precise, enduring shape of their shame. Leonidas got a stone lion. Ephialtes got a dictionary entry, a ghost of a word for a ghost of a man. So we come to the final count. The butcher's bill for 3 days in a narrow pass. 300 Spartans. Dead. Not one was found with his back to the enemy. 700 Thespians who chose to stay when they could have left. Dead. A handful of Thebans who some say were held as hostages. Also dead on the Persian side. 20,000, minimum. The ground was so choked with their dead that Xerxes, in a fit of rage and superstition, had most of them buried in mass graves before he marched on. He left only 1,000 or so visible, a gruesome stagecraft, to make the victory look less catastrophic for his own troops. But numbers are just arithmetic. The real calculation is time. Thermopylae bought Greece 1 precious month. 1 month while Xerxes, shaken and furious, regrouped and advanced. 1 month for Athens to empty its city onto ships. 1 month for the Greek fleet to gather its strength in the Straits of Salamis. When the Persian armada finally sailed into that narrow channel, confident after their land victory, they were met not with panic, but with a trap. The Greeks, fighting for their homes with their backs to the wall once more, shattered them. Sea battles don't leave monuments like stone lions. They leave wreckage on the sea floor and a broken empire's will. That idea that some things are worth the cost, even when the cost is everything, it's why we remember Thermopylae, not because they won, they didn't, but because they made the price of victory so high that the victor's triumph turned to ash in his mouth. Xerxes took Athens, he burned its temples, and then he had to watch his father's dream of conquering Greece die at Plataea, the final crushing land battle made possible by the time and the fury Thermopylae had purchased. Today the pass is quiet. A modern highway runs through it, and the sea has receded, leaving a wide plain where the hot gates once roared. But if you step off the asphalt, you can still find it. The low hill where the last stand was made, and on it a simple stone plaque, placed there centuries later by the Greeks who remembered. No grand statue, just words. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws we lie. And a few hundred meters away, on a different mound, the foundation stones of the Lion of Leonidas still remain. The colossal statue itself is gone, lost to time, but its stone base stares east toward Persia. A silent, enduring watch. Sometimes holding a line isn't about winning, it's about making the other side pay for every step. It's about drawing a line in the dirt, or in this case, in the blood-soaked gravel of a mountain pass, and saying this far, no further. For 3 days, 300 men did just that, and the world shifted.